All right, folks, let's pick up where we left off. This is Professor Sackett-Taylor with a video lecture on part 2 of chapter 7 on unemployment. So let's look at the data. There's a natural rate of unemployment. Like I mentioned before, not all unemployment is bad. During recessions, people may be unemployed for one of 3 reasons. But during normally healthy economic periods, cyclical unemployment tends to fall to 0. And what we see is that during healthy macroeconomic conditions, we primarily have unemployment that is structural and frictional in nature. The natural rate of unemployment is the typical rate when an economy is growing normally. However, when we're in a period of economic contraction or recession, the additional unemployment present is due to that cyclical unemployment from poor economic conditions. So in this slide, anything that comes up with an asterisk, you can think as showing the optimal levels of that variable. So for example, here, in a healthy economy, the level of unemployment U is equivalent to the optimal level U star. Economic output Y is equivalent to optimal output Y star. And the level of cyclical unemployment is 0. So we're only dealing with unemployment due to frictional and structural unemployment. In a recession, the unemployment level is higher than optimal. In other words, we have more people unemployed or underemployed than we would like. Economic output is below the full employment potential, and the level of cyclical employment is positive. On the other side of things, under a period of economic expansion, unemployment is less than optimal, or less than the natural rate of unemployment. During a period of expansion, economic output is above the natural full employment output, and the level of cyclical unemployment is negative. But this is not sustainable in the long run. When we look at employment figures, it helps to remove certain groups of people who, for example, are not really looking for a job. This involves people who are retired, people who are choosing to stay at home to raise their children, people who are incarcerated, people who are active military personnel, obviously children under the age of 16, and many people of all ages who are full-time students. When we remove these people, what we're left with is what we call the work-eligible population. This is people who are civilians, non-institutionalized, and 16 or older. Within the work-eligible population, there are people who are in the labor force and people who are not in the labor force. Those in the labor force are the people who are working or actively searching for work. The others, and this accounts for just 25% of Americans. So if you think of like all the people who are eligible to work relative to the size of the total population, it's about 25%. So we can measure the unemployment rate as the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. So this is an important indicator of the economy's health. Since 1960, the average unemployment rate in the United States has hovered around 6%. During the Great Recession, the unemployment rate went all the way up to 10% and then fell back below pre-recession levels. And now during the COVID pandemic, we've seen places with up to 15% unemployment. We calculate the unemployment rate by taking the number of unemployed people and divide by the size of the labor force, then multiply by 100 to turn it into a percentage. Another way to think about employment is to look at the labor force participation rate. This is the percentage of the work eligible population that is actively working, that's in the labor force. So it shows how many people could be working and relative to how many people are actually working. It's calculated by dividing the size of the labor force by the size of the work eligible population and multiplying by 100 to turn it into a percent. Remember, work eligible population is anybody who is a civilian, non-institutionalized, and older than 16. So in this situation, we've got three folks, Jean, Zoe, and Michael. Which of these people would be considered unemployed? Well, the correct answer is Zoe. Zoe's a recent college graduate who sent out job applications, but she has yet to hear back from businesses, so she hasn't been hired yet. This is an example of frictional unemployment. It's that time lag between the time when you're looking for the right match and when the actual hire happens. So it's important here to note that Jean is a college student who's not currently working. Full-time students and people who are not looking for jobs are not considered members of the labor force and are therefore not considered unemployed. C, Michael, a stay-at-home dad. Well, if Michael's kids go to college and he starts looking for a job, then he'll re-enter the labor force. But right now, choosing to stay at home means that he's opted out of the labor force and therefore is not unemployed. So like I said, the average unemployment rate in the United States since 1960 has hovered around 6%. But this is not the quote unquote natural rate of unemployment. It's just a long run average. What we see here is that on average, there's very little cyclical unemployment. Those are during periods of recession. So overall, the number is above the natural rate. But 6% is a really good reference point to compare unemployment rates across time or even between nations. Rates above 6% are historically considered high, and rates under 6% are historically considered low. So you should notice how the unemployment rate is consistently spiking during periods of recession, which are the areas shaded in blue. This really vividly illustrates cyclical unemployment. But note how long it takes for the unemployment to return to natural levels. After the recession ends. It happens pretty quickly. And as we discussed before, this pattern's typical, but you can see that it's particularly noticeable after the 2008 recession that it took a lot longer in general for us to get back to the natural rate of unemployment. Also, notice that there's always some unemployment, no matter how significant or prolonged we are in a period of economic expansion or contraction. We never get down to zero unemployment. This is because structural and frictional unemployment are always positive. We're always evolving and growing as an economy, developing new technologies, and so experiencing creative destruction. There's always going to be a time lag between the time that people begin looking for work and when they find the work that they actually want to do. So notice, for example, around the year 2000, the unemployment rate falls to less than 4%. What was happening was that in April of 2000, real GDP, right, gross domestic product, was expanding really at a very significant rate, about 6.4%. And so the unemployment rate was really low at 3.8% because there was so many jobs available due to this expansion in our productive capacity. This is the lowest unemployment rate the United States has seen since 1970, but still it's above zero. It's not a zero unemployment rate. So there's always some unemployment in a healthy economy. In the past 2 decades, the labor force participation rate has decreased, and it's hypothesized that it will continue to do so as the baby boomer generation continues to retire. And the reason they're called baby boomers is because there was a specific period of time following the Second World War where we saw a big bump in the population growth rate. And so the baby boomer generation is much larger than the generations that followed it. So as that generation begins to retire, we're going to see a larger proportion of the population exiting the labor force. The demographic changes here also are bringing us into a period of low labor force participation. And the government will have to deal with this in terms of Social Security and Medicare. So when you are working, you pay into these systems. You are paying some of your income into Social Security and into Medicare, so that when you retire, you receive those payments back so that you can maintain your quality of life into your retirement, or that's the idea anyway. But the problem is that Social Security payments and Medicare payments happen in real time as people are retiring, but Social Security and Medicare are accumulated over time throughout the period of one's work life. And so right now we're in a situation where we have fewer people paying into those systems and more people taking out of those systems. So, we have to figure out as a society, and specifically through government policy, how we're going to deal with those issues. Let's look at another trend in the US labor force. So if we were to break this down by sex, between men and women, then the proportion of men in the labor force has pretty steadily declined since the 1950s, while the labor force participation rate of women has significantly increased. What's happening is that, first of all, many more women began entering the workforce over the last 50 years. Not only are women working more and more, which is increasing our labor force participation rate, which went from about 37% in 1960 to 60% today, but the male labor force participation rate is falling. So there's this notion that more women are participating in the labor force, and that should be seen as progress, but it might strike you as a little odd that fewer men are working. But what's really happening here is a multitude of interacting factors. First, people are living longer, and also acquiring more education. And then at the same time, men are spending more time helping to raise families than ever before. Unfortunately, just like GDP is not a perfect measure of economic well-being, the unemployment rate also is not a perfect measure of economic well-being. Each of these measures give us some information and help us to start to paint the picture of what's happening, but they each have a number of shortcomings. So first, the unemployment rate can be too narrow. What the unemployment rate doesn't measure is all the people who want to work, but have lost hope and are no longer looking. Second, the unemployment rate doesn't reveal who is unemployed. And so it doesn't really help us to understand how we could create policies to address those issues, since we don't know who we're trying to help. Third, it's a lagging indicator, meaning that we only know about the employment or unemployment numbers after they've already happened. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States calculates this data month to month and submits or publishes a report quarterly. Let's go into this a little bit more in more detail. So like I mentioned, the unemployment rate could be underrepresenting the true unemployment rate because of a population that we call discouraged workers. These are people who are not working, but want to be working. So you'd think that they would be included in the unemployment rate. But the way the unemployment is calculated is it's only calculated based on people who have actively sought employment. So like are putting in applications in the past 4 weeks. So if it's been more than 4 weeks since you've submitted an application or had an interview, you're considered a discouraged worker and you're no longer counted in the unemployment numbers. These also are people who economists sometimes refer to as marginally attached workers, because they want to work, but they're not working and they're not actively looking. So an example of this is, for example, is like somebody who is working towards their PhD, is in the last year where they're writing their thesis and needs some income. So they want to work, but they can't find work that is going to be matching their skills or fulfilling to them. Or maybe they don't have enough time to take a full-time job. So instead they work bagging groceries. Now, this person is a marginally attached worker. They want to be working more hours, but they've either given up trying to do that at the time being or given up completely depending on the economic circumstances. Unemployment can be too narrow in another way too. It doesn't count for underemployed workers. These are people who currently hold part-time jobs, but would prefer to be working full-time. So underemployment is not working the number of hours that you wish to be working. So this person is counted as having a job, even though he or she wants to work more and is in a position to work more. So in recessions, a lot of people become discouraged or underemployed. That is, they exit the labor force, even though they would really like to have a job, but they aren't actively looking because they've given up trying. Or they're underemployed in that they take a job that's not really well suited to their skills or the qualities that they bring to the job, or they're working fewer hours than they'd like to be. What this does is it increases the gap between the employed and the unemployed, and it increases the gap between the employed and the discouraged or underemployed. So in this graph, we can see that the orange line is including all the workers who are officially unemployed. So this is discouraged workers who have given up the job search and workers who are underemployed or working for part-time because they wish they could be full-time. The gap between this broader measure and the official employment rate, shown by the blue line, grows when we're in a recession. You can see that the distance between the orange and the blue line is much larger during the recession of 2008, indicating that a large number of people became what we call discouraged workers. Like I said before, the unemployment rate is an aggregate number. It tells us about what is happening at the whole economy level, but it doesn't tell us who it's affected. So for this reason, many people believe that the way that unemployment is counted is really inaccurate, because sometimes in a severe recession, for example, unemployment is underestimated because of the discouraged and underemployed. Once they re-enter the labor force to look for a job, unemployment rates actually go up due to the way that we count unemployment, right? So when you go from being discouraged worker to actively looking but not finding a job yet, you become the unemployed. So overall numbers go up. So a solution to this is really just to look at the labor force participation rate in addition to the unemployment rate. This also doesn't give us more nuanced information about who is unemployed, how long they've been unemployed, because short-run unemployment is bound to happen for some people at some times in their life. And it's not that big of a concern. It's long-term unemployment that's a really big concern, because that affects your trajectory in terms of financial management, economic well-being, and personal well-being in terms of health. Finally, we cannot underestimate or ignore that there are significant differences in unemployment rates across race and ethnicity. So here, this labor market data breaks down unemployment and labor force participation by both gender and race. And we can see that for example, if we were to compare Black males with white males, the Black male unemployment rate is more than double the white male unemployment rate. Similarly, there's not as big of a difference, but it is a significant difference that Black females are also unemployed at a higher rate than white females. So this is direct empirical evidence of structural institutional racism, right? The fact that people of color have had less access to training, education, skill building, and are discriminated against in the hiring process. So this is something that as a society, we need to address, because this is a labor equity issue, a human rights issue, and our society will function better overall if all people have equal access to full employment and can benefit from working to not only contribute to society, but to raise healthy, happy families. So in conclusion, we use the unemployment rate as another measure at looking at macroeconomic health. It helps us gauge labor market conditions, but it's not perfect. It lags behind the actual economic activity, so we can't measure it until it's already happened. And it doesn't account for underemployment or discouraged workers. So the unemployment rate includes structural, frictional, and cyclical unemployment. And really, structural and frictional unemployment are natural and part of a healthy working economy. It's cyclical unemployment that is the result of economic downturns that we have to be concerned about. All of this can be influenced by government policy. And we seem to see this taking a bigger part in propping up rates of employment post 2008 recession. And it will be really interesting now to see in live real time what happens as the coronavirus pandemic continues to play itself out. So that's unemployment. We've now looked at two measures, GDP and unemployment rates. Both of these things help us to kind of take a pulse on the macroeconomic conditions that we live in. So that's it for this chapter. Make sure that you go back and check out all of the nuanced mathematical equations involved, because you will want to be able to calculate these things. And we're going to look at some real BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics data in class together, so you can get a handle for what this looks like in real time based on real world conditions. So I'll see you in class.